Virginia kindergartners to learn about slavery at age 5 between playing with blocks and nap time. It's about time those little slackers acknowledge their privilege and atone for their great-grandfather's crimes. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is The Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Dr. Duke Show, the only program that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. Today, we're discussing a new curriculum coming to a school near you that forces children as young as 5 to learn about systemic racism and social justice in the classroom. I can see their little eyes glaze. It's almost like talking to them about, you're not really a boy if you think you are. This kind of topic that you're proposing for 5-year-olds is staggering. These kids are there to learn colors and shapes, maybe a little digital analog counting right on the clock, a little nap time, a little chocolate milk, and you're going to now impose upon them in the ways that you are already imposing sexuality on them and gender. You're going to now impose on them the heavy burden of systemic racism, which means you're going to point out that all the little white 5-year-olds are predators, whether they know it or not, and non-white predators, you're going to tell non-white kids, you're going to tell them at age 5 that all the other kids in the class hate them, that the country hates them, that the world hates them. This is reason number 8,767,412 why you should not send your kids back to public schools in the fall.
And this is actually happening in Loudoun County, which is, I guess, the richest county in the whole darn nation.
Very privileged.
And it's a suburb of D.C., so you know all the kids who are going to those schools in that county are have their little privilege ears open. Yep. Well, of course, Loudoun County is teaming up with the Southern Poverty Law Center because who else would you team up with to do this?
What qualifies Planned Parenthood to write sexual curriculum other than the fact that they peddle sex to kids? Why are they all of a sudden seen as apt educators for little children? And why would you tap the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a left-wing Marxist organization whose only job is to raise lots of money and then to go about labeling any organization they disagree with as a hate group?
It's because they have their own education arm called Teaching Tolerance. We've talked about this before. Teaching
Southern
Tolerance.
Poverty Law Center and tolerance are not two words that go together.
So they're going to, work together to teach us tolerance. They're going to develop the new curriculum. And the proposed lesson plan recommends restructuring history and social studies classes to emphasize slavery as fundamental to American society for students from kindergarten to the 5th grade. And there's a quote in here that I want to read you because it's from a teacher who was smart and actually, at least for now, remained anonymous, probably will be named. But this teacher says, I teach lower grades in elementary school. Never before did I have to teach about slavery. Our standards were always to teach about the famous Americans, George Washington, Martin Luther King Jr., people like that. But it was all very general. In the bigger picture, we highlighted, their accomplishments. Because when you're talking to a 5-year-old, they do not know what any of that stuff means. Right. But of course, we have to teach about all this racism.
Yeah, and the thing that gets me so angry about this is this idea that you heard what the Southern Poverty Law Center said. We are going to restructure history and social studies. We are going to completely change them and make them all revolve around slavery and nothing else. Slavery now, this is in case you hadn't figured this out, Mom and Dad, this is the 1619 Project being implemented by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And what it is doing is it is making slavery the only focal point at which your kids will understand anything about their country. You have a conversation about economics, it's going to be seen through the lens of slavery. You want to talk to your kids about global cultures, it's going to be seen through the lens of America as a slaveholding country. If you're going to talk to your kids about global warming, it's going to be in the context of slavery and racial injustice to the environment. Every aspect of your kids' social studies, political, and history curriculum is now going to focus around that and only that.
And according to their own document, it says that sugarcoating or ignoring slavery until later grades makes students more upset by or even resistant to true stories about American history. So that's what it is. They want to get them young, obviously, because they don't know any better to think otherwise.
Get them while they can feel bad without thinking that they should.
Yep, and it says, long before we teach algebra, we teach its component parts. We should structure history instruction the same way, except you changed how you do algebra. You've changed how you do math. so that kids now are writing tally marks or making big circles on their paper to do math, and then they still get the answer incorrect.
Right. And again, why is no one challenging the premise that the basic fundamental narrative of American history is slavery? That's the only thing that why have you decided? Oh, I know why the Southern Poverty Law Centers decided this, but why have we as a culture allowed this to go? That the primary, the one and only thing that, here's the irony, the only thing that we all have in common as Americans is slavery. Apparently. The only thing we are allowed to see is the reason for everything. So what brings us together is that which by definition divides us. There can be no reconciliation. There can be no fixing of the problem. However many trillions of dollars you can pour into the reparation bin is still not going to change the social justice warriors' mind about what this country is.
That's why the slogan is, divided we fall.
And it's funny. Your public schools are not public anymore. I mean, when you've got Planned Parenthood, who aren't curriculum writers writing curriculum, when you've got Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a left-wing hate group, there's no other way to phrase it. It's a left-wing hate group who is writing a divisive curriculum for 5-year-olds that has reduced history to nothing more than slavery. And no one's fighting back about this. These are not your public schools, Mom and Dad. You don't have a fighting chance. You think it was bad when you were dealing with the big textbook companies, right, that were abetting the Common Core curriculum, Macmillan and all those big. You think you had it bad? They're not even doing that. At least they had professional textbook writers on their team. Who is putting together this radical curriculum? Radicals who don't like America, who don't want you to have any say in what your kids learn. They're not public schools. Already they have ceased to be public schools.
And even this teacher said just as much. And again, this teacher had to remain anonymous for fear of losing the job. What they're trying to do is divide people as early as they can, starting now with kindergartners. That's going to incite hate. They're pointing out that there's whiteness and blackness, and that's crazy. We never taught about that in school. We learn about how to get along with one another and be kind and respect others. But now with this new curriculum that they're adding, it's going to do the total opposite. So they're going to tell a bunch of lies to our kids, teach it in the schools, and then they're going to go off and these kids are going to believe that our education system hasn't been working properly simply because we haven't funded it enough. Because we're basically spreading that lie as we have been for years. The Washington Examiner actually took some time to debunk the lie, because it's a lie, that we've defunded education for years. It was inspired by a tweet from a high school football coach named TJ McKay, who decided to go on Twitter and say, defunding the police sounds radical until you realize we've been defunding education for years. And that tweet actually had 659,000 likes. So once it's that, people think that's the truth and they just spread that like wildfire.
I mentioned yesterday, we mentioned it again today, that we live in a society now where telling the truth or presenting an alternate case is not allowed if that goes against an emotional appeal from the left, right? So this is a classic example of what I mean. This statistic is false. We have not been underfunding education. We've been overfunding it. We've been pouring more and more and more money into the public schools and getting less and less and less return. You've heard the phrase, right, that if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. You heard the phrase, haven't you, that it's only insane people who think they're going to get the same results by doing the same thing? We have been dumping money into the schools as the only solution for about 60 years, and our schools have gotten worse year to year to year. They are not defunded. They are overfunded. They are too much predicated on money, too much predicated on teacher salaries and teacher vacations and teacher pensions and supporting unions. Has nothing to do with who your kids are and how they should learn and what is the purpose of a school. Those questions aren't answered anymore. You've seen yesterday, you've seen today, you will see tomorrow on the Dr. Duke Show the degree to which public schools have ceased to be about anything meaningfully educatory. It is not about mastery of subject matter. It's not about literacy. It's not about preparing you for college. It's about turning your kids into little bots, little prog bots, who will mouth, without even thinking about it, from the youngest ages, they will spit out their progressive values, not knowing what they are because you've put them in their heads. That's all that it is.
And when we talk about how much funding has actually gone into our schools, on average, the United States currently spends more than $15,000 per student each year. And inflation-adjusted K-12 education spending per student has increased by 280% since 1960.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you just stop and think, Go and take a look. Mom and Dad, how much is being spent per student in your school district? Take the time, go look at it, because most families don't. Most taxpayers don't look at it. They just think, oh, we have to just pay this amount. But when you stop and start to think and do the math on it, you realize what a failure our schools have been for how much money has been sent to it. Now in California, where this football coach, by the way, TJ McKay, lives, inflation-adjusted spending on K-12 education has increased by 129% since 1970. Your U.S. Census Bureau data shows that nearly 1/3 of all state budget expenditures go toward education. 1/3 of all state budget expenditures go toward
and our kids can't
education.
Read. Our kids are capable of doing higher math. They have the attention spans that you would expect from people who are on cell phones all the day, with 7-second attention span. Their knowledge of American history is woefully inadequate. Go back to the previous story, right? You're going to change the focus of American history to be about slavery. And even before the Southern Poverty Law Center is going to do that, we already have a culture where the only thing our kids know about is slavery. It's all they know. They know about slavery because they've been taught slavery. Slavery is the linchpin by which you can turn them into progressives. Make them feel guilty, make them feel angry, make them feel like that they're not loved, make them feel like their other classmates hate them. And that's all you got? How are you going to make any kind of progress forward with this kind of rampant ignorance?
That's a question that can't be answered. It's not going to happen.
Ignorance is required for the good little socialist world coming.
Absolutely. So, of course, spreading this lie, if you spend more, you're going to get better results, correct? Of course not. The Stanford University economist named Eric Hanushek actually reviewed nearly 400 studies on the topic, and he concluded that there is not a strong or consistent relationship between student performance and school resources, as we know, because all the money that we give has not led to at all increased reading scores or math scores. In fact,
and you see the socialist impact on our schools. It used to be the more you spent on a thing, the more salary you paid a teacher, the more obligation you had to hold that teacher accountable. If you were a teacher who we're going to hire at a high salary because we're sick and tired of ignorant kids, we're going to put it in your hands to make our kids literate readers, and you don't do it, then we have to fire you, or lower your salary, or find people and pay them that money. But this is where the socialists have stepped in, and the unions. You can be a very highly paid teacher, and again, for what they do, with all due respect, as somebody who teaches 9 months a year, huge benefit packages, better than most anybody else, huge retirement programs. With my 13 years of graduate school, my retirement sucks compared to what the public school teachers are making with a 4-year degree. With all of that, the idea here that we can't hold them accountable when they march out of classrooms for red and leave your kids hanging in the middle of a semester, they get a raise and no consequences. When they tell you they're not going to come back to Los Angeles schools in the fall unless you defund the police and stop funding charter schools. Have you heard any criticism from this?
No.
Have any teachers been fired from this? When in North Carolina, teachers say we're not coming back and teach your kids in the fall, which we are obligated to do because public education is a law that must be followed. We, the teachers of public schools, are saying now, we're not going to come back and teach in your schools in North Carolina unless you give us all kinds of handouts for illegal immigrants.
Yep.
Have you heard anybody in North Carolina? No. You cannot get fired as a public school teacher unless you support Donald Trump.
Oh, we have a teacher, a social studies teacher, maybe one who actually wanted to teach history at some point, but we don't know. This teacher at Palatine High School in Palatine, Illinois, which is basically a suburb, because everything's a suburb of Chicago. It's a northwest suburb. This teacher, who we don't know, all we know is that the teacher is white and female. This female teacher is under internal investigation for a now deleted Facebook post. Here's what she decided to write. I find the term white privilege as racist as the N-word. You have not walked in my shoes either, so do not make assumptions about me and my so-called privilege. You think America's racist? Then you have been hoodwinked by the white liberal establishment and race baiters like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton.
Now?
And so she must be investigated.
And look, this is what I just said in the previous story. The only thing that can get you in trouble as a public school teacher is if you challenge the liberal progressive orthodoxy. And go back and throw that quote up there. It's pretty boldly stated, right? But let's start with that first thing. She's 100% right. The term white privilege, what does it do? It scapegoats people. It's a generalization. It fails to take into account a person's individual characteristics and life experience. And on top of all of that, it judges someone on the basis of their skin color, right? So these are all hallmark bullet points of what racism is. But because they're being applied to white people, that's acceptable. The word white privilege may not be as bad as the N-word, but it is exactly the same kind of scapegoating racial discourse. It is reducing somebody to the color of their skin. And let's be very clear, you progressives don't care about that. If you're taking young white students who have no implication whatsoever in racism and you're forcing them to be guilty of race, you are demeaning them and demeaning their culture and demeaning their parents because of who they are. You are bigots. Throw that up there one more time. So that's the first thing. You're exactly, and she's right. Her plea is the plea for the individual. You have not walked in my shoes. Look, your kids, Katie, your little son is going to have a lot less privilege than LeBron James' kids or Barack Obama's kids, but that can't be taken into account. You think America is racist? Then you have been hoodwinked by left-wing Marxist progressive race baiters.
Especially Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton.
In other words, she's right.
She's correct.
She is demonstrably right.
Correct. She is
But
correct.
she's being investigated now. Had to take that down, right? She had to take down that post.
And a former student named Aaliyah Holloway said they should take immediate action on the teacher. A former student. I just wonder if all these students who are, former students and all this, because we've seen it at the universities too, recent graduates, if they just can't break away and move on with their lives. They have to stay in their spot. Anyway, they should take immediate action on the teacher so that the school knows they are indeed backing up black people and they are in support. Because letting her go under investigation, I feel it's not enough. It's not enough. That is in no relation the same as saying the N-word. That just shocked me. It's not the same.
Yeah, the N-word, which is a slur, right? I'm demeaning you with the N-word as less than human. What have you just done by the phrase white privilege? What are you doing? White supremacy. Everything's white supremacy now.
Yeah,
you're basically saying white people are that which they say you are when they use the N-word.
It's true. So I guess my whole thing, going off a slight tangent here, why have the N-word become such a thing, but it's okay to say cracker to white people? Honky, any of those terms. It's the same thing.
The argument is because we have all the power and they have
it's that white
none.
privilege. It's the white privilege.
Right,
okay.
Exactly.
Well,
so racism's fine if you have power.
Of course, I need to read the response of the administration. Administration response for District 211. The administration was made aware of a social media post made by a staff member. The posting has been removed, and we are currently conducting an investigation and will follow through with appropriate measures. The statements in the post do not reflect the values or principles of District 211. We are truly sorry for any harm or disrespect that this may have caused.
Right. And you know what? District 211.
District 211.
You have policies and statements and curriculum that do not take into account the rights and responsibilities and the individuality of huge numbers of your students. You don't speak for them. You speak for you and your liberal partners.
It's time for some real education. In 1855, Robert Browning wrote the dramatic monologue Fra Lippo Lippi, which first appeared in his collection Men and Women. Throughout this poem, the only speaker is the 15th century painter Filippo Lippi. The poem is written in blank verse, non-rhyming iambic pentameter. Questions of celibacy, church law, and the canon are considered as well by means of secondary characters.
Yes, and a dramatic monologue is really a very interesting kind of a poem. The only voice you ever hear is the voice of the main character. So in this poem, every piece of dialogue, it's one long poetic dialogue where Fra Lippo is talking to a couple of guardsmen. He's trying to slip back into his cell. He's a monk. The Fra in Fra Lippi means he's a monk. He's brother Lippo. And he's snuck out against the curfew. He's a monk, a man of God, a priest. He shouldn't be sneaking out in the middle of the night doing God knows what, possibly drinking, hanging out with the prostitutes, we don't know, or just painting, we don't know. But Lippi is in the process of sneaking back into his monastery when the guards catch him. And so there's this long conversation that Fra Lippo has to the two guards who've arrested him about, and it just morphs into a brilliant commentary on the nature of painting. And so, but you never hear the guards respond, you never see the guards' expression. But through the way Fra Lippo talks in this poem, you get a beautiful understanding of his mind. And so they're complicated things to do. My Last Duchess is one of his best. I think it's probably his best, his most famous dramatic monologue, in which this corrupt, insane duke is talking about, that's my last duchess on the wall, right? She's dead, but we have a painting from her. And as you go through his conversation with somebody who wants to see the picture, you find out subtly through the language of the Duke that he's the one who murdered that first Duchess. Very chilling. Take a look at Fra Lippo, the quote we've got from Fra Lippo. It's a beautiful poem. I urge you to read it. And Fra Lippo was actually a real artist. But here at one point, Lippo is talking to the guardsman about the purpose of art. And he says, "For don't you mark, don't you pay attention, don't you know, we human beings are made so that we love first when we see things painted, things we have passed perhaps 100 times and not cared to see. And so they are better painted to us, which is the same thing. Art was given for that. God uses us to help each other, so lending our minds out." That's a profound statement. Don't you understand, Lippo says, that every day in and out of your house, you walk past that little plot of daisies that are in your garden, or that beautiful blooming maple tree that's right next to your driveway. We walk past things all the time. How often do we glance up at the sky and see the clouds, but not really pay attention to it? God made art for this person, for people. God made art for this purpose. In art, when a talented artist paints something beautiful, we see it in ways we never could see it in nature. That art was made for that, by a human mind taking a beautiful image from nature and then recreating it in a painting gives us a higher appreciation than we could even have in our day-to-day lives when we don't notice such things. Go back to the quote one more time. And so art was given for this. God uses us to help each other, so lending our minds out. Yesterday we talked about water lilies, right? And this is the exact same premise here from Fra Lippo. Don't you mark, we are made so that we love first when we see things painting. By appreciating something in a painting, an image, a flower, a human portrait, we then go back and we are more deeply informed to appreciate the real world. And throw the picture up, Mike, real quick. There is an actual picture from Fra Lippo. And you can see in Lippo's own painting in the early 1400s, you can sort of see that ambiguity, right? You've got a beautiful woman, ambiguous. Is she looking into the eyes of the man who's peeping out the window to the right? Is this some kind of a romantic assignation? Are they having a quarrel? Are they even related to each other? That same ambiguity that you see Fra Lippo talking about in his definition of art in his poem, you see sometimes too in the work of the 15th century painter as well.
All right, as always, you can follow us on Facebook and Parler. And if you have a question for our Friday Q&A, visit freedomproject.com/askduke or send us a message on social media. Now, don't forget, the Dr. Duke Show is offered on more than a dozen podcast platforms, such as Apple, Stitcher, and Spotify. Simply subscribe and consider leaving us that coveted 5-star review to keep the show growing. Now we're going to wrap things up with the fun fact of the day. So federal funding for our schools really didn't begin until about 1965 when the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, was enacted. That's when you can pinpoint, for sure, a steep downfall in education, because education was always meant to be left to the states. Take a look at your Constitution.
And people, when I was on the speaking tour for Common Core, people always ask me, if the public schools are so bad, why weren't they bad from the beginning, right? Why in 1910 or 1920 or 1930 did kids seem to get a better education? And the answer is this. It wasn't federally funded until 1965. Prior to that, there were problems. but you did not have a huge federal entity paying for it that then demanded results or lack of results in the case of the Department of Education. 1965, the government takes over paying for it. 1979, the government creates a organization, a bureau, a entire part of government designed to maintaining education. It's no surprise that it went downhill from there. And that's our show. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke. She's Katie. Until next time, stay out of public schools, my friends.